When Lucy says, "Good grief, Charlie Brown," what does she really mean by that? Do men and women experience grief differently? Are people of faith at an advantage or a disadvantage in their grieving and bereavement? Stay with us as we discuss those questions with Austin psychologist Nick Grant. His answers may surprise you on Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue by Austin Metropolitan Ministries. Our guest today is Austin psychologist Nick Grant. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Glad to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how many years you've been in practice, and see if you got it right yet?
Yes. I've been in Austin in private practice since 1977, and prior to that I taught at Texas A&M and at Auburn University. Graduated from UT in 1973.
Okay. Well, what kind of problems do people bring to you in terms of grief and bereavement?
Most of the time, I'm struck by how different people are in the way they approach grief and bereavement. Usually it's whatever they consider to be a loss, when they have to really change. And the difference in terms of grief and bereavement is that the change goes deeper and sometimes lasts longer and may be transformative for them in their life. And that's different from just coping.
So we're not talking just about death and dying, but there are all kinds of losses that people come to talk about grieving.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if people are attached to things, if people think that something's very central to their life, if they lose that, if they grow beyond it, or if they have it taken away from them or whatever, they have to adjust to how to make their life meaningful without it.
Well, in terms of, particularly in terms of death, how do people know when to come for help, and who do they go to?
Oh, well, death is one of those sort of times when change can be literally reconstitutive for an individual or for a family. And I usually think that when people feel that they don't know who to ask particularly, or the ordinary ways they go for information or for advice to a friend or someone else, might not be what they need. Say if they need to ask questions that they'd feel exposed about, if they'd feel like they're vulnerable and they don't quite know the answers to things and they'd like to talk to someone with anonymity, they could do that. Sometimes, though, people can go to persons who share their values, like their pastor, rabbi, or priest. Sometimes a very good friend can exactly be what they need.
Well, how do people know when? I mean, I talked to a lot of people that are either afraid to go or say, well, yeah, I'm not quite hurting enough, or I can get through this, or, you know, just give me a little time here and I'll figure this out. Are there some guidelines or some things that might be happening in somebody's life that would trigger them to say, yeah, now's the time. I really need to talk to somebody, because why?
Well, sometimes people will start grieving and they may get stuck. And the grieving and the loss may trigger previous losses, and you get a cumulative effect. And then people will sometimes wake up early in the morning. They may feel sad. They may have classic signs of mild depression, which is, a loss of appetite or too much appetite, or they do things that ordinarily would give them pleasure or a sense of diversion simply don't when they feel flat in their approach to the world emotionally. It would be a good thing to talk to people. Also, if they feel like, as I said before, the ordinary people they would talk to, they just couldn't talk to them.
Talking to a friend
or someone that they know in the church,
right,
and so forth. Sometimes it'd be good to talk to a therapist. But, a lot of the people that are very well trained about loss and grief are, in fact, people in the ministry. They're the ones that really are trained very well in this.
Well, do you think men and women experience this grieving differently or in different ways, or how would you characterize that?
I don't think it's so much about being men and women. Maybe I like to use a lot of something called psychological type preferences to look at stylistic differences people approach life. And I could talk about that a bit because, say, someone who's extroverted is different from someone who's introverted in the way they may approach grief. The extroverted person may definitely need to talk to someone to interactively allow themselves to be supported and to come
somebody
to
who's more outgoing,
or
the very willing to talk. Yeah.
The contact itself gives people energy and allows them to problem solve. A person who's introverted may have to have quiet time alone and may find it very helpful, say, to journal, to write, and then to share what they journal as a basis for talking with someone else. And that can be very helpful to them.
You ever have people write letters to the deceased?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Especially when there's something like lack of closure. If it's, say, a sudden loss. If they really hadn't had time to dialogue, talk very much about issues that weren't finished.
Sort of unfinished business. That's
Unfinished
one of the ways
business,
to do
yeah.
that.
Writing is a good thing, particularly for people that are a little more introverted.
We hear a lot about good grief, and a kind of common phrase, of course, in the Peanuts comic strip as well.
Right.
Is that an oxymoron, or is grief good?
Grief, I think, is part of being alive, because we're bound to go through losses throughout our lifetime. Death is not the only one we're going to be dealing with, so there's going to be repetitions of how people deal with having to let go and go into something new. That could be due to growth, it could be due to loss, or whatever.
Kids going off to school.
Kids
as
going
we
off to
both
school,
experienced.
we're both dealing with that,
Right.
and how that launch period where people had, say, built a lot of their day-to-day experience around raising children, now it's a brand new thing. It's not a bad thing, but it's a new thing.
It's a
And-
big loss having a kid go off, actually, whether it's to kindergarten or to college. Real similar kind of losses. What am I going to do with this time? And
Right.
who am I? And,
Right. It really has to do with our attachments, and people try to form meaning any way they can around their attachments and what they consider to be important. And when that shifts, that's a transition. The important thing to remember, I think, about grief is not just coping differently. Grief can be about something that's so very deep within people it reconstitutes them. And I always like to think that grief moves with the speed of the trees. It's more like a vegetable level, and so we grieve with the speed of the plants. That's very important for people to remember.
That is really important.
In our urban
Yeah.
civilization,
Yeah.
where we don't have time for the pain.
Or not
And-
just urban, but you type something in on your computer, you expect instantaneous response, and it's almost going beyond the urban environment to kind of a cyber environment where people expect their emotions maybe to move at the same rate, and you're saying that's not true.
Emotions, deep emotions, especially adjustment, moves with the speed of the plants. And so when people are grieving, often I've known ministers and rabbis and priests that have told them do you have a garden? Would you work in the garden? Or give them a plant to pay attention to. That's the speed with which we really grieve. So the old wise traditions of a passage of seasons before people make any big decisions, like a year, is very wise. It's very
So
important.
it's not just the passage of time, but it's a passage of growth, I like the passage of seasons. That's kind of got a
Right,
nice
it
ring
is, and
to
it's
it.
literally about seasons. It's very much about that.
So there's no time frame here. I hear people often say, well, it's been 6 months, I should be over this, or it's been a year, I should have worked this through. So you argue people would do this at different speeds?
Yeah, the real answer to that is to say, well, when is this going to be over? And it takes as long as it needs to take. People can have a different depth of attachment. I would think when I've known people who have lost their pet, for instance, and they've grieved deeply because, yes, the pet was important, and yes, pets have personalities, but also the attachment. It's a tribute. See, grief in the positive sense is an acknowledgement of the importance of the relationship.
It's almost like a gift.
It is. It's a tribute. It is it's acknowledgement.
It's interesting, a gift that's very, very painful for us to go through, and yet really a kind of a part. It's what we do here. We attach, we detach, we attach, and grieving is a part of that.
I think it is. I think also grieving is a transformative part of it. It's the part that we carry with us forward in the future. Like that person lives on, the part that we take forward. But we are changed in real relationships. And some of the times where we really experience most deeply is when we're grieving. We really understand the profound significance and how we have been changed by that person, by knowing that person.
You think grief has an end point? I mean, people think about it as though I'm going to go through this is going to be painful, but then there'll come a point where I'm not doing this anymore.
I
Is
think
that
it sort
true?
of sneaks up on people. Yeah, I think it has all the subtlety of growth, though. Sometimes you'll find that you're not thinking as much about the person or specific incidences or whatever of their life, but you're more aware of the present and maybe looking ahead a bit more in terms of restructuring your life. And so
What about
forth.
that? Do you think the pain changes along the way?
Yeah. I think pain can be a pain where you feel like, just like a broken bone, you can feel the terrible piercing pain of the bone cutting through the leg or whatever, but then there's the soreness. And being sore is different from just having a terrible life-threatening pain. And soreness is part of healing.
Then what about long-term grieving? What can people, it's 20 years after the event, do you still hear people saying, gee, you know, on the date of the death, I still experience some of that?
Sure, there's anniversary grieving because we're reminded, of course, of the person. That, too, is part of the tribute. I mean, it's like it can become something where we're almost like touching a part of our arm that was broken. You know, like valuable. I remember the experience. I also remember the acknowledgement of the value of that person to us. And we can go through different experiences of what the person meant to us, different years and anniversaries. But sometimes people get stuck in their grief. Sometimes they actually, the old model of, you know, denial and anger and bargaining and depression and transition and so forth. Sometimes people get stuck there because the grieving simply activates very deep areas of feeling, unworthy or incomplete in some way. And
so it could be connected to other issues that we're dealing with.
Very much so. Yeah. It's actually, though, an opportunity to deal with other issues.
Yeah.
That's the other part. It's really a very natural part of growth.
Huh. Well, so then you would say that it would be important to commemorate the event? Is that important for people? The anniversaries and rituals are important?
Oh, I think one of the healthiest things I've seen is the Day of the Dead, where in the Latino community, where they go and they sit by the graves and they talk to the deceased and they have a picnic there, and it's the family gets together. This is the family across generations. I think how much healthier we'd be in the recovery movement sometimes if we could talk across generations, like with that much skill. Yeah, I think that anniversaries are very important. And to see us in the flow of generations is to be wise. All of us start dealing with that very seriously when we get at midlife and beyond.
Which right where we are.
Certainly,
that's right.
Well, you might be.
Yes, right. Yes, right.
But the issue of we're going to be dealing with, what does it mean for me to be here now at this time, you know, remembering our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers and children ahead of us.
Kind of looking at the whole perspective.
The whole picture. Grief is a very important part of that because it talks about the meaning of all those relationships to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're going to take a little break here, and we'll be back in the second half of our show, and hope you'll come back and join us. Thanks very much. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. Before we go back to our interview with Dr. Nick Grant, an Austin psychologist, I wanted to make sure everybody knew about the Last Acts website. It's the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation response to looking at end-of-life care in America. You can click on that website. It has a lot of other sites to follow on. For information about grief and bereavement, really good end-of-life care, and information about a program that will be coming on in September called Moyers on Dying in America. And kind of look for that in early September. So, back to you.
Right.
Yes. Well, we talked a little bit about before the show, do people of faith have an advantage or a disadvantage in dealing with grief and bereavement, or does it matter at all?
Oh, personally, I think there's an advantage to it. I know there are people of very good will who may not be in a denominational faith and so forth who have a relationship with something greater than themselves. You see, grief by definition would be dealing with something that is overwhelming. And if one has a relationship with something greater than yourself, kind of a working relationship of some kind, it can help in the grief process.
Well, how's that help? I mean, do
Well,
people do, we talked a little bit about ritual. Does
there can
prayer,
be ritual, there can be prayer, there can be talking to God as a person understands God.
Uh-huh.
Certainly, there can be sharing this with others in a tradition
talking
of,
about in a group or
in a
a
group of
church?
some kind, in terms of one's way of thinking about what happens after death.
Yeah,
and
talk a
talking
little bit about that. Have you had people, I mean, do you think that's a real advantage, or does that help? Or do people come in with absolutely no faith and no concept or no belief in life after death, and they do just as equally well as people who have that kind of concept?
It really does depend. I think it depends on whether people have optimism about life itself. If they embrace life, I think they are much better equipped to deal with with death. You see, old Chinese book said the opposite of life is not death. The opposite of life is stagnation, is standing still. And so death is part of life. Death is the renewal of life in a way. It's the deconstruction that occurs before you come back. And so faith traditions, and all faith traditions, I think, deal with profound loss and deconstruction, and in a sense the taking apart of the conscious ego, we'd call it, and then the reassembling of it
So it's
through
like
ritual and
life, death, resurrection, life, death, resurrection. That's
I think you find that
kind of
in
what we do
every,
here.
all the religious practices of the major faiths, you will find that.
And the opposite of that, as you said, would be stagnation.
Yes,
and not-
refusal to move, refusal to do anything. I always think it's really great that in the center of Dante's hell, you don't find fire, you find ice.
Ooh.
Because everything's frozen solid at the very deepest core of it's non-movement, and that's the opposite.
And
So-
would that be when somebody's feeling stuck?
When they're feeling stuck, and people don't want to. I think people want to keep moving in life. That's to be alive, and so we do need each other during grief. That's the other thing that I think is important, is we're not supposed to grieve alone. That's one of the things we don't do alone, and we need to be interactive. It may be inside a tradition of some kind where there are rituals and prayers and community life and lots of customs, or it may be with a good friend over coffee regularly. That would be important.
Yeah, I think the key word there is regularly as well.
Right.
I mean, some sort of, again, ongoing relationship that helps us kind of keep things in perspective or keep moving. Just
I
keep
think
moving.
it's very important to keep things in perspective. You've certainly talked about and written about this, but it's that people get ashamed in the United States that they grieve. We literally sell medicines on, I don't have time for the pain. I should be over this by now. I'm really concerned something's wrong with me. I just can't get back to work like I used to. Men, especially males who feel like their value sometimes is just based on performance, will say, I'm broken. You know, they shoot horses, don't they? Get rid of me. I'm not good for anything now. I can't function. So that's the first thing, is people feel ashamed that they grieve, and to say it's really natural. It's even, here, take this potted plant, study it, you're like this now. Remember that, and you're supposed to learn from looking at roots going deep in the soil, so go deep in yourself. We can learn so much from studying agriculture and going out in the country when we're grieving, I think.
So you think it's more a matter of shame than guilt? We talked a little bit about
Well,
that
I
earlier.
think, if some people feel like they're failing some internalized standard, that, they should be performing more, et cetera, that would be guilt. But
If you're really a good Christian, why you'd be over this now?
Oh, yes. Christians should have hope. They shouldn't be grieving. It's like they shouldn't be attached in the first place.
Really.
To grieve means you were attached, and to show significance.
I've heard people say, they feel, I guess it's a shame that their grief is somehow feeling like they're not trusting God through this. But you'd say it's very different from that.
I would think it's like, it is interesting to me that when people go through a very, very deep kind of loss, it does challenge them to kind of look at what I call the contract with the universe. That is, they thought religious faith, and especially, say, denominational religious faith of some kind, shielded them from the ordinary losses of life.
Yeah, really good point.
But then that also, if we were shielded from the losses of life, we would be shielded from growth. We'd be shielded from life itself, and we wouldn't be alive.
So religion's really a way to work these things through.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
What about humor and grief? We talk about putting things back in perspective, and you find humor
so
assists.
important. Yes, it's very important. And you find people telling jokes at funerals, that's
Right.
part of the Irish heritage. I love that, and it's absolutely true that the reframe that people get, the perspective that is needed, is provided by humor. In the old war movies, somebody's cracking jokes on the patrol going into this life and death situation. Well, that's an archetypal figure of what we all have to do going into things that are bigger than us, because if we can't reframe it with humor, we fear we won't survive it. But as we go through changes where we have to let go of things at such a fundamental level, humor is extremely important, extremely
So
important.
people shouldn't feel guilty about weird thoughts that come to their mind at the funeral or even during the dying process.
Oh, and that they're telling jokes,
Uh-huh.
and they're telling jokes about people's lives and so forth, and they think that's
Yeah.
somehow irreverent. And, the last person in the world that should be withheld from is the person who's dying, who would love to get a kick out of it, I think, at that point.
Right, and actually tell jokes in the presence of the person who's dying. And
Oh, I think so.
I mean, I think you're right. It's one of the things that we do at funerals is to kind of put perspective on things, and it really does. It puts it back in perspective. It's like life and death is what we do.
Right.
And
The real big issue, I think, for us in America, as you said, putting perspective on it, is that death reminds us that we're out of control in certain areas, and that's really bad for Americans. Someone said that, the two things that get to be obscene, and they oscillate back and forth historically, are sex and death. And when sex is obscene, death is a cult of sorts. And that was going on in Victorian England, where they had all this preoccupation with death and prolonged grieving, et cetera, but sex was very taboo. Now we got sex all over the
Everywhere,
place,
right.
and grieving and death is obscene and is invisible and is taboo. So they just vary back and forth. Both of them have to do with profound and creative transformation. Both sex and death.
Two things, as you know, Woody Allen said he'd experienced once in his life. Do you see signs of grieving in the church?
It better be,
Because
because the church better change and to stay alive, and it has to let go, it has to constantly update. I mean, in any living faith tradition, I think there has to be the taking of what has worked and what is central and applying it to what's going on now, what's going on with the people of this generation. Someone said a lot of dogma is the codification of other people's religious experience. And it's important that dogma turn into, you heard when you get older, or maybe when you're dying, your karma runs over your dogma.
yeah, I've heard that.
All right. Well,
Of course, I don't say that too often.
no, but that's the idea is it has to be relevant. Or when people really didn't have a choice about church or about religious attendance, that might have been a terrible crisis. But today they have a lot of choices, and they'll simply leave if it's irrelevant. That's the thing that's so sad.
So do you see, I mean, I guess you could argue that evidence of other spiritual groupings or coming together in the rest of the culture today, particularly in the United States, might be a healthy sign of spirituality moving maybe out of kind of what we have seen as maybe dogmatized religion
Oh, I think so.
into spirituality?
Especially in areas like death and marriage and these real critical life moments, you'll see humans having ways of expressing themselves that look downright secular, but if you just scratch the surface a little bit, you'll see this poetic and relevant kind of connection to things that are very deep in people. For religions that say that they're deeply incarnational, I think that would be central to their theology.
Let's say a little bit more about that, deeply incarnational.
Well,
How does that-
for say people that, well, I'm just thinking monotheistic religions that talk very much about that, and the tradition I'm from is Christianity. So, if that's centrally incarnational, that believe in God and man being united, and somehow that has to do with the integrity of the person, well then anything that's human contributes directly to the theology of a person and their relationship with God. So how can anything be unholy? How can anything be unholy
if these things are of God?
if it's
Yeah,
human?
yeah.
And the important thing is that's, when people avoid things, we avoid pain, but it's not about our beliefs, it's about our fear.
Well, how do we deal with the fear then? I mean,
Oh man, I don't know. That's with humor.
with humor
is one. I think one of the greatest ways to do it is humor.
Just humor.
Another is to think of people that we've really admired and talk with them, whether they're present or not. Don't do this at the bus stop, but I mean,
Bad idea,
talk with them
right.
if they're present or not, and let how they see us become the way we see ourselves, and we won't be so afraid. Our job is to treat ourselves the way these people have treated us and the way these people have loved us, because if theology is to be believed, that's how God sees us. And so we can hold on to them, and that will give us courage to go into areas that frighten us.
So that we're really not alone.
We're really not alone.
Yeah. So people often ask, is there any way to kind of inoculate ourselves against bad grief? Any way to prepare for? I mean, we talk about religion kind of being a way to deal with this, but it's not going to protect us from the pain of the grieving.
No, I think it's to deal with change and to understand that change is part of life. I like to think of people having relationship skills as helping prepare them for grief, because grief is a relationship if we let it be. It's the most profound relationship with the person who's died, the people that are living and that we're continuing to relate to, and usually having a changed relationship for people with God.
I don't know who said it, but somebody said life, or death ends a life, but not a relationship.
That's right.
It's really important to remember, because the relationship's going to continue, even though the person is not physically present.
Right. I mean, if it's true that we do carry within us what they have thought of us and how they've seen us, if we decide to adopt that, that's what goes right into the self-esteem core. If we intentionally see ourselves that way, it can give us a resiliency in life that will help inoculate us from grief.
So there might be some daily things that we could do, talking about daily prayer or daily some sort of spiritual.
Sometimes people can pray with the deceased. They can have them there in their imagination, imagine them and pray the way one would pray. I think that you can. I've had people making very tough vocational decisions sit down with someone that's deceased, someone who has really loved them and was important to them, and you can find this with your heart's radar. You know who these people are, and talk with them. I've seen people straighten up in their chairs and make wise decisions about their lives. I think that people can, if they're having a pretty tough time looking forward, make a little list at the beginning of the day of 3 good things that could happen that day, even if they're very small, and then change their attentional habits toward expecting some good things to happen that day.
Was there any final thoughts, no pun intended, you'd like to leave with us?
One is
that
today. Grieving is very natural, and it's a part of the transformation that occurs in all of our lives. It's an opportunity to celebrate that relationship.
Celebrate the relationship.
Right.
It's very interesting, because people feel often very depressed or sad, and it's not to denigrate that sadness or say that we shouldn't feel that way, because we do, but to see it as an occasion for change and for remembering who we are with that person, with others, with God, can be a way to give us strength and courage to move forward.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks,
really appreciate the time with you, appreciate your good sense of humor, and appreciate your wisdom above all. So thanks very much for being with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. We hope we'll see you again next week.